riffs. Matt, you're gonna have to go get your guitar for the next one.
Oh no!
All right, welcome back to Inside the Music with Andy Schwartman. We got Matt Schlesinger and Tony Kiefer with us. I'm your producer, Senor Reeek, with my little guitar here, my little campfire guitar, and that's the last you're going to hear of that thing. There's your host. There's your host right there, Andy. This is
What's up?
Part two of what? What are we doing here?
This is part 2 of Inside the Music with Andy Schwartman.
Yeah, what's this episode about?
The Seattle rock, the Seattle scene of the 1990s, basically the grunge rock of the 1990s that came out of Seattle, Washington.
And so far, we haven't gotten any further than just talking about how much we love Pearl Jam, but that's where we left off. So
Right.
I'm going to ask Matt, what do we know, if anything, about Pearl Jam's tour dates that were postponed due to COVID? Are they going to be able to start making up for those this year and next year?
I am willing to bet it's 2022. They do the 10 Club, which is their fan club, and then you get seats through the 10 Club. It's a lottery thing. It's a whole production every year, or every tour, rather. But this tour was the largest amount of 10 Club seats than any previous tour. So they've not canceled any of these tours. They've postponed it as a way to make the 10 Club members not have to go back through the lottery again, because all hell would break loose if somebody wins the front row, wins rail seats and general admission or something, and now all of a sudden you're in the nosebleeds because we redrew on the lottery. So they've postponed North America for as long as I can tell. Europe was rumored to be rescheduled for this year, but then there's also rumors that Italy has already canceled that date, and we're looking at 2022 for anything that was. And that will be show number 10 and 11 for me in Nashville and St. Louis.
Yeah,
Nice.
right on. Nashville road trip. Any excuse for a Nashville road trip.
Right?
Exactly.
Andy, let's take it back to the beginning and talk about really the roots of Pearl Jam. Where did they start?
They were the roots of Pearl Jam are from 2 specific Seattle-based bands, Mother Love Bone and Green River. They started in 1990, so 31 years ago. That's hard to believe. I was 3 years old. But anyway, they started in 1990. Some of the band members, like I said, were in a band called Mother Love Bone, and then some were in another band called Green River. And there was a guy whose name was Andy Wood, who was in the band Mother Love Bone.
Yeah.
And they so when he died, Mother Love Bone folded, and then their first name was Mookie Blue Blaylock, my bad. And then they decided on the band name Pearl Jam.
Yeah.
And they've been Pearl Jam ever since. So
I thought that Green River stuff was pretty interesting, but Mother Love Bone was great.
Oh, okay.
That was a band that a very, very charismatic singer, Mr. Andrew Wood, and that was a great loss. I can remember being into them before he died, and my entry point with Pearl Jam was like knowing someone at Sony that said like, well, those guys are actually getting a new thing with a new singer. And I had a promo CD single of Alive and a couple other things on it.
Mm-hmm.
But like even before 10 came out, I was just in the right place at the right time, which means working at Everybody's Records in 1991.
Nice.
And so I kind of got in on the ground floor when Pearl Jam morphed out of Mother Love Bone. Tony, what are your thoughts on some of the side projects of those bands, like Temple of the Dog and Mad Season, things like that?
Oh, yeah. First, I got to tell a funny story, though, about Mookie Blaylock. I don't know if you guys are familiar with a place called the Cat Club in L.A. It's a
I've heard of it, yeah. course.
rocker club and stuff. Well, Ricky Rackman, the guy who owned it, has a podcast.
Of course, I've heard of him. Yeah,
and he tells a story.
Headbangers Ball.
Yeah, he tells a story about this band who came in and they were playing, and the damn lead singer wanted to climb up on the speakers and do all this stuff, and the cat guys to settle down. So I love that connection with Pearl Jam, and there's always this stuff about how grunge killed rock, and I love that they played the Cat Club and that they were too wild for the Cat Club. I think that's awesome.
That rules.
But
Yeah, I've heard of Ricky Rackman, and the way that I've heard of him is through the show Headbangers Ball.
Right.
And that was my introduction to his name.
Yeah.
So,
a lot of those bands, Alice in Chains and Boogie Blaylock played there, but the stuff that they were all doing together, there's a chemistry that those guys have. And that's the great thing about the Seattle scene, is it's not just like the way the bands know each other and interact with each other. And like you said, with Temple the Dog and Mad Season, the way they come together and play all these other projects, and they were just as, the records, like that Temple the Dog record is awesome. And it's just a chemistry in that whole scene that shows through the side projects.
It is really weird when you hear those stories from one coast to the other, and how I've heard it described as incestuous the Seattle scene is, and everybody's in each other's bands and helping each other out and everything like that. And then you go to New York City and you hear interviews with like Dee Dee Ramone talking about stealing people's guitar cables to fuck the other band over because they didn't want that band to play better than them that night. So it's crazy, from one corner of the map to the other, how different that was. And, you've got like Mark Arm from Mudhoney and Jeff Ament from what would be Pearl Jam for Green River. And then Stone Gossard steps in, and then Mark Arm leaves and he steals Matt Lukin from the Melvins, and they create Mudhoney, and it's just a never ending who's who, or, they all came from somewhere, and they all link back up in that way. I think Chris Cornell and Andy Wood were roommates.
yeah.
And when Andy Wood died, Cornell wanted to create a tribute to that, and that's where Temple the Dog came from.
Oh, okay.
And that had Soundgarden's drummer, Matt Cameron, in Temple of the Dog in the 90s. And then 1998 rolls around, Jack Irons leaves Pearl Jam, and they need a drummer for the Yield tour. So Matt Cameron comes back in, 8-9 years later, and just has to wing it, pick up 80 songs out of nowhere to go on this tour that's already booked because, Jack Irons has bailed. But it's really neat that they would all step in like that.
Yeah, totally.
You need a scorecard to keep up with all those lineup changes.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
The never ending, like a family tree that just
Yeah, where the branches grow into each other.
Right.
What about Soundgarden? What did you say where did they come from out of that scene? Where, how did Cornell get together with like Kim Thale and those other guys?
I'm not as, up to speed on that as I wish I was. I'm not sure how he got involved. Do you know, Tony or Andy?
No.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I think Cornell was an out-of-town guy that, came in to be with them, and that's where, seeing guys like Jeff and Mike McCready and everything like that, and it was just kind of a perfect situation of, hey, my buddy Andy needs a place, and you need a place, and why don't I'll introduce you, and
yeah,
it's how cool. I heard those guys had a competition to come up with and perform for each other one song a day that they would have to, and of course the majority of it is goofy shit that was 30 seconds and never became anything, but then every now and then that one would click and stick around, and it's a really neat idea of just pushing each other to do that and stuff.
Yeah, that is
really great story.
Well, I know Soundgarden, they had some stuff in those very early days of, doing a video series like we are now discussing the Seattle scene of the 90s. At some point, you got to mention Sub Pop. And I think Soundgarden was one of that first wave of bands that was on Sub Pop when they were, very independent and just bubbling up, and very few people outside of Seattle had really heard of the label or those bands at first anyway. And then they kind of came up out of obscurity. I want to say that there's some other bands like Alice in Chains and some others that maybe
Yes.
Unless I'm mistaken, I'm not sure they were actually together that far back, and maybe they sort of came into the picture a little later.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I feel like they had been around,
Yeah, they had
But-
been.
but
Yeah,
I'm
they
not
were.
sure exactly when. It's very interesting where I don't know where you draw that line as to what is and what isn't grunge. You know what I mean? I think it's
Yeah.
just really shows how big that grunge movement got, because
Yeah.
there, you start to lump just 90s bands in general in there with the Seattle grunge scene. Like,
True.
I think Stone Temple Pilots gets thrown into that group a lot, and they're from San Diego, I think. They're not even from Seattle.
That's
And
an interesting point you make there. Just like the Haight Ashbury scene in San Francisco in the '60s, when things started happening there, musicians went
Yep.
there to get something together. They weren't all necessarily from there.
right.
Right.
And I think the Melvins weren't from Seattle. They were from Washington. And, there's Nirvana is from Aberdeen, but
Yeah.
it all kind of gets sucked into that Seattle
Yeah, exactly.
scene and movement and everything like that. Because I don't know where you would draw that line as
Right.
to, is Jane's Addiction grunge at that point? But if Stone Temple Pilots is, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Although
But
I think
I
they're
really
a
think the main
post-grunge
Seattle
band,
group
but-
they're the ones.
Oh, you know
Right.
what that means, Andy? We got to run.
Nice.
Let's wrap up part 2.
Thank you, everybody, for enjoying part 2. Here comes part 3.
Matt, Tony, thanks for being there, you guys.
Nice
Of
guys.
course.
Alright, good job. I really don't have another Seattle riff to start this.